Welcome to Unit 5, Lesson 1. We'll look at calculating percent of a number. All of Unit 5 will focus on percents, which you've seen before in 6th grade. So hopefully you remember that when we talk about percents, we're talking about a value out of 100. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we're dealing with 100 of something. It just means we're using 100 to represent the whole. So when someone says they did 100% of something or they have 100% of something, that means they have the whole thing. So when we're talking about percents, 100% represents one whole. So if you go in the top right corner of your notes, it says Caden took a 40-question science test. He answered 80% of the questions correctly. How many questions did he answer correctly? So we know a couple of things here. We know that there were 40 total questions on the science test, and we also know that he answered 80% of them correctly. What we're trying to figure out is how many questions was that he answered correctly. So what we do, if you look at this bar model at the top of your notes, you will see that 40 has been stretched all the way across the top, and then 100% has been stretched all the way across the bottom. So we're using 100% to represent all 40 questions. So you just stretched 40 out so that it lines up with 100. So to score 100% on the test, you would have to answer all 40 questions correctly. So one thing I could do would be to break this bar model in half, and we know that would be 50% of the model, which means when I talk about the 40-question test, I would need half of 40. That would be 20 questions. Well, it says that he answered 80% of the questions correctly. So I know that he's actually somewhere in this part of the bar model. And that part of the bar model is broken up into 5 equal pieces. And I've got to get from 50% to 100%. So I have to make a jump of 50 percentage points. And I've got 5 boxes to do that in. So that means each one of those boxes is another 10%. So this would be 60% and 70% here, and then 80%, and then 90%. So here's the 80% that Caden scored, represented on the bar model. So we need to know how many questions that would be. Well, we're traveling from 20 questions to 40 questions. So we're making a leap of 20 questions. So from 20 to 40, we've got to get up to 20 more questions. We've got 5 boxes to do that with. Well, 20 points divided by those 5 boxes means that each box is 4 points. So this would be 24 questions answered correctly. This would be 28 questions answered correctly, 32, and 36. So if he scored an 80%, that means he answered 32 questions correctly. So that's kind of one way to see what's happening when you talk about a percent of a number. And we can use those bar models as long as we're dealing with numbers that are friendly with 100. That isn't always the case. So while the bar model is really helpful for you to see what's going on, it isn't probably the most efficient problem-solving strategy when you're using percents. So let's look down here at the bottom. On the left, it says to find a percent of a number, convert the percent to a decimal, and then multiply. So for example, if we're trying to find 24% of 76, so 76 is the whole thing. So if we were to do a bar model for this, it would stretch out 76 so that it lines up with 100. And we want to find 24% of that. Well, 50% would be half. So we know we're dealing with something that's less than half. We know that 25% is a fourth, so 24% is pretty close to 1/4 of 76. So we kind of have an idea of what the correct answer should be. But to get the exact answer, again, we can convert the percent to a decimal. So as a decimal, 24% is equal to 24 hundredths. All we do is look at our percent value and divide by 100. So if the decimal was here, we'll go 2 to the left. That's how you divide by 100. So 24% is equal to 24 hundredths. And then we'll multiply that by 76. So 76 times 24 hundredths. So 4 times 6 is 24. 4 times 7 is 28 plus 2 is 30. We don't need the 2 anymore and we can zero over. 2 times 6 is 12. 2 times 7 is 14 plus 1 is 15, and then we'll add. And look back at the question, we had 2 digits following the decimal. So in the answer, we'll have 2 digits following the decimal. So 24% of 76 is 18 and 24 hundredths. And you can see where that would be a hard one to do using that bar model, and because we would have to have broken the bar into lots and lots of pieces. So this is just a faster problem solving strategy when you're finding percent of a number. Okay, the next one says 12.5% of 160. We know that 50% is half. We know that 25% is a fourth. So we're looking at something that is significantly less than 1/4 of 160. So we'll just convert our percent to a decimal. So 2 to the left gives us 125 thousandths. So we'll do 125 thousandths times 160. And we'll 0 there, and then move over to get to the 6. And 6 times 5 is 30. 6 times 2 is 12, plus 3 is 15. 6 times 1 is 6, plus 1 is 7. And now we'll 0 over twice, and we're finished with those numbers that we carried. 1 times 5 is 5. 1 times 2 is 2. And 1 times 1 is 1. And now we'll just add. And in the question, we had 3 digits after the decimal. So in our answer, we'll have 3 digits after the decimal. So 12.5% of 160 is 20. Okay, the next one, 60% of 1,280. Again, we're finding percent of a number. And this would be a little bit more than half of 1,280 because 50% is equal to 1/2. So as a decimal, 60% is 60 hundredths, which we can also just write as 6/10. That's the same thing. So we'll take 1,280 and multiply that by 6/10. 6 times 0 is 0. 6 times 8 is 48. 6 times 2 is 12, plus 4 is 16. 6 times 1 is 6, plus 1 is 7. In the problem, we had 1 digit after the decimal. So in our answer, we'll have 1 digit after the decimal. So 60% of 1,280 is 768. So that's how you calculate percent of a number. Turn the percent into a decimal and then just multiply. Okay, now let's apply this to some real world situations. So the first one says, Casey is a judge at a dog show. In one particular group, there were 120 dogs. 25% of the dogs were working dogs. 40% of the dogs were herding dogs. The rest were sporting dogs. How many of the dogs were sporting dogs? Okay, we have a couple of choices here. We could find 25% of 120, and that would tell us how many working dogs there were, and then find 40% of 120, and that would tell us how many herding dogs there were, and then we could subtract those out because it says the rest were sporting dogs. So we could do it that way, but we also know that the percents should add up to 100 because that's all of the dogs. So 25% plus 40% plus whatever percent the sporting dogs are should equal 100. Well, 25 plus 40 is 65. So if I subtract 65 from 100, we get 35. So I know that 35% of the dogs are sporting dogs, but the question doesn't say what percent, it says how many. So I would need to find 35% of 120. Well, that looks like the problems that we just did where we turned the percent into a decimal, so 35 hundredths, and then multiplied by the whole number. So 35% of 120, we'll do 120 times 0.35. So 120 times 35 hundredths. 5 times 0 is 0. 5 times 2 is 10. 5 times 1 is 5, plus the one we carried is 6. And then we'll 0 over, and we're done with that number. 3 times 0 is 0. 3 times 2 is 6. And 3 times 1 is 3. And then we can just add. And in the problem, we had 2 digits after the decimal. So in the answer, we'll have 2 digits after the decimal. So that's 42. So there were 42 sporting dogs. So 35 was the percent of the dogs that were sporting dogs. 42 is the actual number of dogs that fell in that category. Okay, last example. A group of students planning to go on a trip to Philadelphia has set a fundraising goal of $2,400. They have raised 36% of their goal. How much money do they still need to raise in order to meet their goal? So we're being asked what they still need to raise. They've already raised 36%. So if I subtract 36 from 100, because 100% would be the total amount they need to raise. So we can just subtract. and we get 64, but that's percent, that's not dollars. They still need to raise 64% of their goal. So they still need 64% of 2,400. So we can just turn our percent into a decimal. It becomes 64 hundredths. So we have 2,400 times 64 hundredths. So 4 times 0 is 0. And then again, 4 times 4 is 16. 4 times 2 is 8 plus 1 is 9. And then we'll 0 over. So we have 6 times 0 twice. And then 6 times 4 is 24. And 6 times 2 is 12 plus 2 is 14. And then we just add. And then we had 2 digits after the decimal in the problem, so 2 after the decimal in our answer. So they still need to raise $1,536. Now, the other way to have done that, it said they had already raised 36% of their goal. So you could have found 36% of 2,400 and then just subtracted that from 2,400. But that would give you an additional step. So we know that if they've already raised 36%, we were able to subtract 36 from 100 to see what percent they still need. And that's it for Unit 5, Lesson 1, percent of a number. We'll be learning how to solve several different kinds of problems that involve percent. So keep in mind that what you saw here was just how to solve questions where you know the total and you're finding a percent of that total. If you have more questions or want to see some more examples, let us know. If you're ready for the skill check, we'll open that for you. Have a great day.